My name is Elise Turner. I'm 36 years old, and I've spent 3 years being deliberately, carefully careful. Careful about what I call myself around my stepson, Jonah. Careful about staying in the background at school pickups when his birth mother is present. Careful about never once, in 3 years, correcting him when he calls me Elise, instead of anything warmer. At his 7th birthday party this past spring, Jonah tripped running across the backyard, split his lip on the edge of the picnic table, and came sprinting straight past his own mother, straight into my arms, sobbing the word Mom before either of us could stop it. I felt him say it against my shoulder before I understood what had happened. Then I looked up and saw his birth mother, Kayla, standing perfectly still by the cooler, her face doing something I'd never seen it do in 3 years of careful, polite coexistence, and I understood that whatever came next was not going to be about a 7-year-old's accident at all. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the smallest, most human moment can crack open something much larger that's been sitting underneath a family for years. If you've ever been blamed for something you spent years actively trying to prevent, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because what Kayla was actually afraid of that afternoon had almost nothing to do with a word a hurt little boy said without thinking. I should explain before anything else how careful I genuinely tried to be, because I want this told honestly and not as a martyr's version of events. When Derek and I got married 3 years ago, Jonah was 4, and I made a private rule for myself before I ever moved into that house that I would never be the reason his relationship with his own mother felt threatened. I never asked him to call me anything but my name. I stayed quiet at school events when Kayla was present. Let her have the front row at every recital, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference she wanted to attend. I built my entire relationship with that little boy around the specific exhausting discipline of never once encroaching on territory that wasn't mine to claim. There were small moments over those 3 years that tested that discipline more than I ever let on. The first time Jonah asked, unprompted, at 5 years old, whether he could call me something other than Elise, I told him gently that Elise was perfect, that some kids have 2 moms and some kids have a mom and someone else who loves them just as much, and that either way was completely fine, but that I thought it might make things easier for everyone if we kept it as Elise for now. He'd shrugged, the way 5-year-olds shrug off things that don't matter to them nearly as much as they matter to the adults around them, and gone back to his cereal, and I'd gone into the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes over a kindness I wasn't even sure he'd remember by dinner. Kayla and I had built over those same 3 years something I would have called a working peace rather than a friendship, cordial handoffs at the door, polite texts about allergy medication and school project deadlines, a careful mutual agreement, never spoken aloud but understood by both of us, that we would coexist around this child without ever making him feel like he had to choose a side. I thought, honestly, that we'd done a reasonably good job of it. That birthday party made me question whether the peace I'd believed in had ever actually been as stable as I'd assumed. The birthday party moment itself happened fast, the way these things always do, faster than either adult in the yard had time to manage gracefully. Jonah's lip was bleeding. He was scared and in pain, and children in that state don't calculate who's technically supposed to comfort them. They run toward whoever's arms feel safest in that specific second, and mine happened to be closest. I held him, checked the cut, told him he was okay, and it was only once his breathing steadied that I looked up and saw Kayla, and understood the word he'd said was still hanging in the air between all 3 of us, like something none of us could take back. Kayla didn't say anything at the party itself, not directly to me. She got very quiet, very controlled, gathered her things 20 minutes earlier than she'd planned to leave, and told Derek, in a voice pitched just low enough that only the 3 of us adults standing near the gate could hear it, that they needed to talk, soon, about what exactly had been going on in that house. I want to be honest that I spent that entire evening replaying every interaction I'd had with Jonah over 3 years, searching for a single moment I could have coached, could have encouraged, could have done differently, and coming up, each time, empty. I didn't sleep much that night. Derek tried gently to reassure me, told me Kayla was probably just embarrassed, that she'd calm down once she'd had a few days to process it, and I wanted badly to believe him. But some instinct I couldn't quite name kept snagging on the specific way her face had changed at that gate, not hurt exactly, or not only hurt. Something closer to fear, the kind of expression I'd occasionally seen on clients at the accounting firm where I worked, right before they admitted to a financial problem they'd been quietly managing alone for far too long. I didn't have a name for what I was noticing yet. I just knew it didn't quite match the story Derek was telling himself. The first contradiction surfaced 2 days later, when Derek relayed more of what Kayla had actually said to him on the phone. She'd accused me, directly, of coaching Jonah, of deliberately cultivating the word mom behind her back, building toward exactly this kind of moment. It didn't match anything I actually knew about myself or my own behavior. And the accusation sat strangely, because Kayla had never, in 3 years, seen me do anything even remotely close to that. I started to wonder, turning it over that week, whether her fury was really about what I'd done, or about something that had nothing to do with me at all. The first hidden detail arrived by mail, 5 days after the party, faster than I expected any formal process to move. A letter from a family law mediator, requesting a scheduling conference to discuss modification of the custody arrangement, citing in careful legal language emotional confusion experienced by the minor child and concerns regarding boundary maintenance between households. I read that letter twice, struck by how quickly and how formally it had been assembled, not the language of a mother reacting in raw emotional pain, but the language of someone who'd had a document like this drafted and ready to send the moment she needed it. I called my own sister that night, not for legal advice, just to have someone outside the situation to talk to, and she asked me the question that ended up sitting with me longer than almost anything else that week. She asked whether it was possible Kayla had been building towards something like this for a while, and whether the birthday party had simply given her the excuse, rather than the actual reason. I told her I didn't know yet. I remember how strange it felt to realize, hanging up that call, that I actually believed my sister might be onto something before I had a single piece of proof to support it. The trust shift came from Derek himself, in the days after that letter arrived, in the specific way he kept steering our conversations away from one particular subject whenever I tried to plan our response. I noticed it first when I suggested we simply request a joint conversation with Kayla to clear the air, and he changed the subject almost immediately to logistics, to lawyers, to anything except sitting across from her directly. When I pushed, gently, asking what exactly he was so anxious about beyond the obvious custody concern, he went quiet in a way that told me there was a second conversation happening underneath the one I could see. I watched him more closely after that, the way you start noticing a limp once someone points it out. He took calls in the garage that he used to take in the kitchen. He started leaving his laptop closed even when he stepped away for just a minute, a habit I'd never once seen from him in 3 years of marriage. Small things individually meaningless, that together painted the picture of a man carrying something he'd decided, somewhere along the way, wasn't mine to help carry. The personal betrayal came 2 nights later, when Derek finally admitted, sitting at our kitchen table long after Jonah had gone to bed, that he'd known for months, actual months, that Kayla had been requesting early disbursements from Jonah's education trust, the one his late mother Vivian had set up before she passed, and he hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to start a fight over money that technically wasn't fully mine to have opinions about. I sat with that admission for a long moment before I understood what actually hurt about it, not the money itself, but that he'd been carrying a whole other layer of tension in our marriage for months, and had decided, quietly, on his own, that I didn't need to know. The first real consequence arrived at the actual mediation scheduling conference, where the mediator, a measured woman named Fatima Osei, explained that pending a full review, the court could, at Kayla's request, temporarily adjust the current custody schedule to reduce overnight time with Derek's household while the situation was assessed, a real, immediate threat to the ordinary rhythm of my relationship with Jonah, not some abstract future possibility. I sat in the waiting room during part of that conference, since I had no formal standing to be in the room for the custody discussion itself, And I remember the specific helplessness of hearing muffled voices through a closed door, unable to do anything except wait to find out whether the shape of my week with a child I loved was about to be rewritten by people who weren't required to ask my opinion about it. Derek came out afterward looking gray, told me the schedule wasn't changing yet, just under review, which felt like both relief and a suspended sentence at the same time. The unexpected ally arrived through a phone call from Harold Whitfield, the attorney who'd managed Vivian's estate, and remained the trust's designated co-trustee alongside Derek and Kayla under its original terms. He called Derek directly, careful and a little apologetic, explaining that his office's routine review had flagged an unusual pattern of discretionary withdrawals over the past year and a half, and that he felt, out of respect for Vivian, an obligation to raise it now rather than simply process the next request without comment. I sat in on that second call, once Derek asked me to, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by how carefully Harold spoke about Vivian, a woman I'd never met, gone almost 2 years now. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd been the kind of client who asked more questions about the emotional intentions behind her estate documents than about the tax implications, unusual in his line of work, and that he'd always respected how much thought she'd put into protecting a grandson she'd known she might not get to watch grow up. It was the first time in this whole ordeal that I felt like someone else in the situation actually understood what all of this was supposed to be for in the first place. The evidence that changed everything arrived in the form of 18 months of trust account statements Harold sent over, showing 5 separate emergency disbursements requested and approved under the trust's primary caregiver discretion clause, each one loosely justified as related to Jonah's needs, but totaling an amount that, laid side by side with the actual invoices attached, didn't cleanly map onto anything a 7-year-old's expenses would plausibly require. I felt for a few days after seeing those statements something dangerously close to vindication, the sense that whatever this custody fight had actually been about, it clearly wasn't only about a word said at a birthday party. Harold, cautious and procedurally careful, paused any further discretionary releases, pending a formal review, and for a moment it felt like the natural checks built into Vivian's trust were simply doing exactly what they'd been designed to do. The second betrayal came from the dates themselves, once Harold's office compared their internal audit calendar against the timeline of Kayla's custody modification filing. The formal request for schedule review had gone out the same week. Harold's firm sent its routine annual audit notice to all trust-linked parties, a notice Kayla, as co-trustee, would have received directly. Her sudden, urgent concern about Jonah's emotional confusion hadn't emerged in a vacuum. It had emerged, with suspicious precision, right as her own financial arrangement with that trust was about to come under formal scrutiny for the first time in 18 months. I sat with that timeline for a long time before I said anything to Derek about it, mostly because I didn't want to be the person who assumed the worst about his ex-wife the moment I found something that fit a convenient narrative. But the dates didn't leave much room for another interpretation once I laid them side by side, the audit notice on a Tuesday, the custody filing requests the following Friday, 4 days that felt less like coincidence and more like a woman scrambling to reinforce her position before a different kind of scrutiny arrived at her door. The stakes became fully legal within the following 2 weeks, the custody mediation formally escalating into a scheduled family court filing, while separately, Harold's firm opened its own formal fiduciary review of the trust's discretionary disbursement history, 2 processes now running in parallel, each with the power to reshape a different piece of our family's daily life. Fatima explained in a call meant mostly to prepare us for what the coming weeks would actually look like, that custody modification proceedings rarely move as quickly as the emotional stakes make them feel, that we should expect a series of scheduled conferences rather than a single dramatic hearing, months of paperwork and calendar coordination standing in for whatever cinematic courtroom moment either of us might have been quietly bracing for. I found that strangely steadying, the same way Constance's warning had once steadied a friend of mine through a different legal ordeal entirely, the slowness itself acting as a kind of guardrail against anyone's worst impulses winning too quickly. The hidden motive surfaced during discovery, once Kayla's own attorney, working through the financial disclosures the custody case now required, revealed something Kayla apparently hadn't told anyone in her own family either. She'd lost her job 8 months earlier, quietly, had been unable to keep up with rent and a car payment on unemployment benefits alone, and had used the trust's loosely worded discretion clause as a private lifeline, rather than admit to Derek or to anyone exactly how much trouble she was actually in. The difficult choice arrived once that context was fully visible. Derek and I could pursue this with the full weight the fiduciary review now made available. Formal clawback demands, financial accountability proceedings that could seriously damage Kayla's standing in the custody case itself, or we could look for a way to correct the structural gap in the trust without turning a mother's private financial desperation into a weapon used against her relationship with her own son. I want to be honest that some small tired part of me, after weeks of feeling accused for something I hadn't done, wanted the harder option. I didn't choose it. I remember sitting with Derek in our car outside Harold's office, engine off, neither of us reaching for the door handle yet, going back and forth on exactly this question for almost 20 minutes. Derek, to his credit, was the one who first said out loud what I think we'd both been circling, that whatever Kayla had done wrong here, punishing her financially in a way that bled into the custody case, would ultimately punish Jonah too, and neither of us wanted to be the reason his relationship with his mother got harder instead of easier. It didn't make the decision feel good exactly, it made it feel like the only version of this we could actually live with afterward. The hidden history came from Harold. In a quiet conversation over coffee, he arranged specifically to give me some of the context. Derek's grief hadn't let him fully process. He told me that Vivian, in the final months before she died, had privately expressed concern to him that the primary caregiver discretion clause was too loosely worded, that she'd meant to have it tightened before finalizing her estate, and had simply run out of time. Vivian herself had anticipated exactly this kind of vulnerability, years before any of us knew we'd eventually need to address it. The power shift came from combining Harold's professional standing, the documented spending pattern, and Vivian's own known, unresolved concern into a proposal rather than an accusation. Derek and I approached the situation not as adversaries seeking to punish Kayla, but as co-parents proposing a structural fix, tightening the trust's discretion language the way Vivian herself had intended, along with formally recognizing my limited role as a secondary notification contact for trust matters directly affecting Jonah's care without ever asking for any control Kayla currently held. The desperate countermove came from Kayla's attorney regardless, who, feeling the ground shifting, escalated hard in the custody filing itself, alleging that Derek and I were using the trust review as leverage to strip her of both financial standing and parental authority simultaneously, a characterization that, for a tense 2 weeks, threatened to turn what had started as a structural fix into a fully adversarial legal battle none of us actually wanted. Those 2 weeks were some of the hardest of the whole ordeal, harder in some ways than the original accusation at the birthday party, because now the conflict had a legal machinery behind it that felt harder to slow down once it started moving. Fatima warned us that filings like this sometimes take on a momentum of their own, attorneys arguing positions their clients themselves might not fully recognize a month later, and I understood, watching Derek field increasingly formal emails, why so many custody disputes end up costing families more than the money at the center of them ever could have. The evidence that finally closed the last gap came from Harold's own routine audit process, uncovering a bank record showing one of the flagged withdrawals had gone directly toward Kayla's overdue rent payment, plainly categorized, not disguised or laundered through some elaborate cover story, simply a desperate, undisguised choice made by someone with very few options left that month. It reframed the entire pattern, not as calculated exploitation, but as a single mother quietly drowning and reaching for the only unlocked door available to her. The complete truth landed on all of us slowly, over that difficult stretch of weeks, a full picture finally visible. Kayla's custody filing had never really been about Jonah calling me mom at all. That moment had simply become the spark she reached for, a convenient, emotionally resonant justification for a defensive legal move. She was already quietly preparing, terrified that a formal trust audit might expose both her financial desperation and, in her mind, threaten her standing as Jonah's primary parent if the review revealed how much she'd actually needed that money to survive. Sitting with that understanding, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected to feel toward her at all, a kind of reluctant recognition. I thought about every version of myself that had ever reached for the nearest available anger instead of admitting the actual fear underneath it. And I realized the accusation at that birthday party, as unfair as it had felt aimed at me, had probably been the easiest thing in the world for Kayla to say out loud compared to the sentence she actually needed to say, which was simply, "I'm scared I'm failing him, and I don't know how to ask for help." The final confrontation happened in Fatima's mediation office, all four of us present, Harold joining briefly at the start to lay out the trust review's findings plainly before stepping back out. I let Derek and Kayla have most of that conversation, understanding it was theirs to have first. Watching Kayla's carefully maintained composure finally crack somewhere in the middle of explaining, haltingly, exactly how bad the last 8 months had actually been, and how ashamed she'd felt admitting it to anyone, especially to the man she used to be married to. She talked about sitting in her car outside the unemployment office, about not telling her own mother for 3 months because she couldn't stand the pity, about the specific humiliation of watching her son run into someone else's arms at his own birthday party, and understanding in that instant that everything she'd been quietly failing to hold together might finally become visible to everyone at once. Derek listened without interrupting, something I don't think he'd fully managed to do for her in years, even back when they were married, and I watched a version of their old partnership flicker briefly back into the room, not romantic, just the specific tenderness of two people who'd once built a whole life around keeping one small boy safe. I spoke only once near the end, when there was a pause long enough to hold what I needed to say. I told her plainly that I had never once tried to replace her, that I never would, and that Jonah calling me mom by accident on the worst possible day didn't erase who his actual mother was, not to him and not to me. Kayla didn't respond right away. She nodded, once looking down at her hands, and I understood that was as much as either of us could reasonably ask of that particular moment. The legal and financial consequences settled, in the following months, into something proportional rather than punitive. The trust's discretion clause was formally tightened, exactly the change Vivian herself had once intended, requiring joint co-trustee approval above a modest threshold going forward. The prior withdrawals were clawed back in full. Harold structured a repayment plan for the portion that genuinely exceeded reasonable interpretation of the original clause, while the portion tied directly to documented hardship was, with Derek's blessing, formally forgiven. The custody mediation resolved without a contested court battle, the existing schedule preserved, with clearer, calmer communication protocols added for both households going forward. Fatima helped us draft a simple written understanding, nothing legally binding beyond what the custody order already required, just a shared document both households kept, outlining how we'd handle exactly this kind of moment if it ever came up again, an accidental word, a slip of affection that meant nothing more than a scared child reaching for comfort. It felt almost anticlimactic, putting something so emotionally enormous into 3 calm paragraphs on a shared document, and I think that was exactly the point, that the biggest fights in a family often deserve the least dramatic resolution available, the kind that just quietly holds from then on without needing to be revisited. The emotional justice, when it arrived, looked smaller and more human than any courtroom vindication could have. Kayla called me directly, 3 weeks after the mediation closed, something she'd never once done in 3 years, and thanked me quietly for not using what Harold's review had uncovered to attack her custody, standing when I easily could have. It wasn't warmth exactly, not yet, but it was the first honest thing she'd ever said to me directly, and I understood it as the opening of a door neither of us had thought to look for before that spring. We talked for almost 40 minutes that afternoon, longer than any conversation we'd had in 3 years combined, mostly about Jonah, his obsession with a particular dinosaur documentary, his stubborn refusal to eat anything green, small ordinary things that felt enormous, simply because we were finally saying them to each other instead of around each other. Near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, she said she was sorry, genuinely, for the accusation at the party, And I told her I understood being scared enough to reach for the nearest explanation that didn't require admitting the real one, because I'd done versions of that myself, plenty of times, just never with stakes quite this high. The final quiet revelation came months later, going through a box of Vivian's old papers with Derek, sorting through what remained of his mother's things. Tucked inside an early draft of the trust document, in Vivian's own handwriting, was a short note I don't think either of us was meant to find quite this way, addressed simply to whoever loves my grandson well enough to argue about this paperwork. She'd written that she hoped, whatever conflict eventually arose over these pages, that the people fighting over them would remember what the trust had actually been for. Not control, not territory, just a grandmother's attempt to protect a little boy she'd never gotten to watch grow all the way up. Derek read it twice, sitting on the floor of that storage room, and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said his mother had always been better at anticipating people than any of them had given her credit for while she was alive, and I thought about Harold's earlier description of her, the client who asked more about intentions than tax implications, and understood that this small note was really just the last, most honest version of the same instinct, a woman who'd known somehow that love and paperwork would eventually tangle themselves together around this child, and had wanted whoever untangled it to remember which one actually mattered. Jonah still calls me Elise, most days the way we agreed a long time ago, gently without either of us making it a rule that needed enforcing. Sometimes running through the backyard, scraped knee, bad dream, an accident at school, it comes out differently, and I've stopped flinching when it does. And so I think has Kayla. Some words aren't really about replacing anyone. They're just what a scared kid reaches for in the moment that feels safest. And I've learned, slowly, that there's room in a 7-year-old's heart for more than one person to hold that particular kind of safety without either of us losing anything real. That's my story. One accidental word at a birthday party, one loosely worded trust clause, and months it took two women who loved the same little boy to finally stop treating each other like a threat. If this reminded you that the loudest reaction is sometimes protecting the most private kind of fear, take that as your sign to look for what's actually underneath someone's anger before you decide what it means. Share this with someone who's ever been blamed for something they spent years trying to prevent. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.